The grand mansion that once stood tall and proud now seemed to loom over them like a memory too painful to touch. The sprawling gardens that once stretched in vibrant shades of green had now dulled with neglect, and the grand gates were closed forever. It had been sold. The house that represented all of Taehyung's power, prestige, and his once unshakable empire was no longer his. The richest man in the city was now a shadow of the person he once was. Taehyung sat outside on the stone steps, his head bowed and shoulders trembling, his sharp, refined suit crumpled and dirt streaked. His once meticulously styled hair was falling over his eyes, which were clouded with unshed tears. He had been crying silently, but the agony was visible on his face, a man whose world had been torn apart. He didn't say a word, but the silence was deafening. Wine watched him from behind, her heart tightening in her chest. She had always been a shadow in Taehyung's life, merely existing in the background. Their marriage had been nothing but a business transaction, a union of convenience. He had never looked at her the way he looked at his girlfriend, never offered her more than passing a glance or an empty thank you when she'd done something kind for him. Vine was her knife. She had known from the beginning that she was only a substitute, someone Taehyung tolerated. He never hid his feelings. His hurt had belonged to someone else, someone glamorous, someone who was now long gone, having left him when his company fell to pieces. But now it was just the two of them. The golden boy, the CEO, everyone revered, had hit rock bottom, and no one stayed by his side except Ryan. Without a word, she approached him, her steps soft but deliberate. The weight of their reality was pressing down on her, but there was no anger in her heart, only empathy. She had never asked for his love, but she had always wanted to be there for him. Maybe not in the way a wife usually would be, but as someone who could offer him the solace he didn't know he needed. As she sat down beside him on the cold, hard steps, Taehyung didn't look up. His breath was shallow. His lips tight as though He were holding back a flood of emotions. Vian's presence didn't make him flinch, but he didn't acknowledge her either. Taehyung, Vian began softly, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't know what to say. What could she say to a man who had lost everything? A man who had never let her in but now had no one else to turn to. It's going to be okay. His silence was painful. For a moment she thought he might lash out on her, blame her for being there, for trying to comfort him when he didn't want her. But instead he let out a shaky breath, his eyes flickering towards the mansion that was no longer his. How? He whispered, his voice breaking in a way Ryan had never heard before. How is it going to be okay? Everything, everything is gone. Everything I worked for, everything I had. She's gone too. His voice caught on the last words, and a single tear slid down on his cheek. Though he quickly brushed it away, as if ashamed to be seen so vulnerable. Ryan's heart twisted at the sight. This was a man who had always been so composed, so unreachable, and now he was unraveling before her. She hesitated for a moment before she reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. He stiffened at her touch but didn't pull away. Because you're still here, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. And as long as you are here, it can get better. It's not going to be easy, but you don't have to go through this alone. I'm still here, Taehyung. I always have been. He closed his eyes tightly as though her words were too much for him to bear. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. The wind rustling the dry leaves around them, and the distant hum of the city that had turned its back on him. I never asked you to stay, he muttered after what felt like an eternity. His words were laced with bitterness, but also with something else, regret maybe. I know, Van replied, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to. He turned his head slightly, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were red rimmed, and there was a raw vulnerability in them she had never seen before. Why are you doing this? Why are you still here when you could have left like everyone else? Van swallowed hard, but the weight of his questions settling between them. She didn't have an easy answer, but she spoke from her heart. Because I see you, Taehyung. Not the CEO, not the man with the money or the mansion. I see you. And I know how much this hurts, but you don't have to go through it alone. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm just, I just want to help. Maybe as a friend. His lips quivered, and for a moment it seemed like he might break down completely, but instead he nodded, a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a grand acceptance of her support, but it was enough. In that small, quiet moment, sitting on the steps of the mansion that no longer belonged to them, Taehyung allowed himself to lean into Vine's presence. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to, but in silence, there was an understanding. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't completely alone. But they couldn't stay here. The house had been sold, the papers signed, they had nowhere else to go. Vian glanced at him. Taehyung, she began softly, careful not to startle him. His head tilted slightly in her direction, but he didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the empty house, as if still grappling with the reality of it all. We can't stay here, she said gently, and I've been thinking there's a place we could go, somewhere we could stay, at least for a while, until things settle down. He didn't respond at first, his body still as stone. She wasn't sure if he was listening or too deep in his own thoughts to hear her, but then his lips parted. Where? He asked, his voice low and rough. Van hesitated for a moment, unsure of how he'd react. It wasn't exactly a place he'd expect or even want to go, but it was all she had to offer. Orphanage, she said quietly, the one I grew up in. Mrs. Park, the owner, she knows me, and she'd let us stay. It's not much, but it's a roof over our heads. For the first time in what felt like hours, Taehyung turned his head fully to look at her. His expression was unreadable, a mix of surprise, confusion, and something else, perhaps embarrassment. An orphanage, he repeated as if the word itself tasted foreign on his tongue. Pine nodded, her gaze steady but soft. It's not luxurious, I know, but it's home to me. It's warm, and there are people who care. It's better than sitting here with nowhere to go. I earned well as a teacher. We can rise again. We just need to adjust a bit. She spoke with hope and a smile. Taehyung blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to process her words. He looked away again, his jaw tightening. I don't belong in a place like that. Vine bit her lips. She understood his pride, his need to hold on to the remnants of life he once had. But that life was gone now, and no matter how much he resisted, this was the reality. I know it's not what you're used to, she said gently, choosing her words carefully. But we don't have any other option right now. It's just for a while until we figure things out. You don't have to do this alone. Taehyung exhaled a shaky breath, his hands clenching into fists. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the ground. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken emotions. Van waited, giving him the space he needed to process everything. She didn't push him, didn't demand an answer. She simply sat beside him, a steady presence in the midst of his turmoil. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Taehyung spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to do this, Van. I've never been without. I don't know how to start over. Van's heart broke at his confession. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. You don't have to know right now. We'll take it one day at a time. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time he didn't flinch at her touch. His eyes remained downcast, but the tension in his body began to ease ever so slightly. I can't believe this is my life now, he muttered more to himself than to her. Van squeezed his arm gently. Life isn't always fair, but we can make the best of what we have now. He didn't respond immediately, but Ryan could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was fighting against himself, against the pride that had built him up, but now threatened to tear him down. After a long, agonizing pause, Taehyung finally nodded, his voice hoarse as he spoke. Okay, we'll go to the orphanage. Ryan let out a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding. Relief washed over her, but she didn't let it show too much. Instead, she smiled softly, her hand still resting on his arm. It will be better, Taehyung. We'll get through this. He glanced at her, his expression with a mixture of exhaustion and vulnerability. Thank you for staying when you didn't have to. Van's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had waited so long to hear something like that from him, even if it was just the smallest acknowledgement of her presence in his life. I'll always stay, she said softly, her voice filled with quiet sincerity. Together they stood, walking away from the mansion that no longer held meaning toward a new beginning neither of them had expected.